This is Behind the Headlines, with behind-the-scenes analysis on issues affecting Pennsylvanians, sponsored by the Susquehanna Valley Center for Public Policy. Now, here's your host.
Hi, welcome to a new edition of Behind the Headlines. From Erie to Philadelphia, from Scranton to Pittsburgh. It's Behind the Headlines. I'm Charlie Greenewalt. I'm the Senior Fellow of the Susquehanna Valley Center for Public Policy, and I'm joined by my co-host, Maura Donnelly. Maura, welcome.
Hello, Charlie.
Well, the economy, the president tells us the economy is humming along nicely.
He says
and
that, yes.
Things have turned a corner, and there's only blue skies ahead of us. But
was he singing that when he said
it? Bore a little bit of a resemblance to Bing Crosby, I thought. But we want to have someone who perhaps is the best expert on our state economy here with us today.
Someone in the trenches.
Indeed.
Yes.
And so we're lucky enough to have Gene Barr with us. Gene, you are the president and the CEO of the Pennsylvania State Chamber of Business and Industry, and we thank you for joining us today.
Great to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
Well, thanks for coming back. I don't know, how is the president right? Just on a national level, how do you see the national economy for a minute?
Well, I think it's important to look at a number of things. First off, this has been the longest recovery when you look at those things. It's just taken us a long time to get to this point. We're doing slightly better. We're doing better. And what words you want to use, it's better than it was, although I guess the last quarter we hit a bit of a bump in that growth wasn't what we had anticipated. Part of the problem is the rest of the world in certain cases. The people with whom we trade aren't doing as well as we would like. There are other places in this world that aren't doing well. I think from a U.S. perspective, what has helped us significantly, which when you drive down the street you see, is the, I call it the reemergence of Pennsylvania's energy. At least the petroleum side, but the oil and natural gas side. We've always had historic strengths in coal, nuclear, emerging strengths in wind and solar. This new strength in oil and natural gas is tremendous in that it's helping us be more competitive from a manufacturing basis, and certainly consumers as they drive down the street. I just bought gasoline for $1.99 the other day, and that's first time that's happened in a long time.
Yeah.
And keep in mind, it is without a doubt Pennsylvania and America's growth in this industry that in many, many ways, to a large degree, is fueling that for consumers.
And that is happening despite the president's best interest instead of because of them, isn't it?
To a large degree, look, he's of the mind that he wants to put significant restraints on anything he views as contributing to greenhouse gas emissions. So that has certainly been part of it. Pennsylvania's coal industry has been hit hard by that. We believe that coal can and should survive as part of that through clean coal technology side. Unfortunately, there are people out there who simply lump all fossil fuels in and say we have to do away with them without acknowledging the role that these fuels have played not only in providing people jobs, but in moving our economy and our society forward.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk a little bit about Pennsylvania specifically.
Sure.
I know we still have some challenges in finding the right people for the right jobs. What are you hearing from employers in Pennsylvania about that?
We do, and that's a great question. When I go out and I talk to people across Pennsylvania and I ask what keeps you up at night question, I get the usual healthcare costs are too high and I don't like my taxes and red tape is really difficult to deal with. But almost invariably, it's I can't find the people I need to fill the jobs I have. When I drill down, it's where you can't find the people with the skills you need, can't find the people to come to work on time, can't find the people to pass drug or alcohol. The answer is yes, 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 yes. Can't find people show up and work on time, sometimes at all. The drug or alcohol issue, this casual recreational use is a problem. But the biggest problem is that unfortunately, for those people, particularly in the technologically oriented sides, they have a difficult time finding the people, but it holds true across the board. It holds true for people who can't find a truck driver with a CDL, who can't find a welder, who can't find a pipe fitter, who can't find an electrician. It holds across the board. So increasingly for the chamber, one of our big issues is trying to work to realign. And the burden is on us as much as it is on those people providing education to make sure that we're letting people know what the opportunities are, not just this year and next year, but 5, 10, 15, 20 years down the road, and trying to realign what I call realign that pipeline so the people coming out can go into jobs, can go into careers that will sustain a family.
Well, do you think too many of our kids are being steered towards college when they should be heading towards the trades or some other degree that would help them meet this need?
You know, there is one thing that unfortunately all of us as a society have done a great job in education, which is denigrating the two-year trades. We've told people, look, we've all done it. We've all said to our kids, you're going to four-year school.
Yeah.
It may not be the right thing. Getting a 4-year liberal arts degree, I have one, is great. I think it's benefited me, but sometimes a year or 2-year degree. We have kids coming out of Penn College in Williamsport who are coming out and starting in the natural gas fields at $70,000, $80,000. Wow. Sometimes it's not necessary to go to 4-year school. It depends on what you want to do. And a lot of times, as I mentioned, the people who can go and do a 1-year or 2-year or do an apprenticeship program are going to do as well. And those jobs on the trade side, oftentimes, we don't have the people to fill those.
Well, how do we get word to these kids as they're about to graduate high school that there are so many other options open to them that may be family-sustaining jobs, and give them a particular skill that's valuable, not just as soon as they graduate, but for years to come?
I think part of that is getting to them even before they're seniors, to letting them know. There's kind of an issue in this country, and I think we should lay it out on the table. In other countries, for example, in parts of Europe, they test children early on and say, you have the aptitude to do this, you have the aptitude to do this. If I ever said,
they get steered in that direction immediately.
If I ever said, hey, you know what, I want to go and be a nuclear engineer. With my back, there's no way I would ever have the aptitude to do that. So, and then they would steer you. The trouble is we would never do that in this country. Parents wouldn't stand for it.
Well, because everybody would want to be a football player, or
everybody says,
be a superstar. I want to be a superstar.
My kid can be a neurosurgeon. Well, guess what? They might not.
Yeah.
So since that probably won't work in our society, how do we let them know what the opportunities are? How do we kind of reorient this to say, hey, you know what? You might not have to go and spend $250,000 for a private. And look, they're wonderful schools in Pennsylvania, don't get me wrong. We have some of the best educational institutions in the world, but it's not necessary for every kid to go get a 4-year degree. And we have to, do that in high school, but to be honest, in junior high, start orienting kids, and even pushing them more in towards the STEM side, which we're finding a real lack of people.
And STEM is? Science,
technology, engineering, and math. I'm sorry to use that acronym
That's okay. That's for our viewers, just in case.
Thanks for clarifying that for me.
This is something I was going to ask you about, and you've gone to now, Gene, and that is the problem isn't just at the college, with colleges and universities, but it's actually with the primary and secondary schools in Pennsylvania, where there is, in some instances, denigration of vocational technical education and of 2-year degrees, and we have to somehow address that. I don't know what the best way to do that is. Is the chamber working at all with schools to promote vocational technical education? I mean, I have a PhD, and I work at a university, but by golly, my contractor, my plumber, my electrician, they all make more than I do, and that's fine. They probably work harder than I do, and they deserve the money they get.
Boy, I hope your bosses are watching, Charlie.
And they enjoy their life.
They do.
So
exactly.
how do we need world-class machinists. We need world-class electricians and plumbers. How do we get the message through to our children, Gene?
We have started that. We have started to work with the providers. We've started to work with state government through Department of Labor and Industry. We've participated in various meetings with our members, with other providers, trying to show, here's some examples of how some of these organizations have filled these jobs. It's tough, let's be honest, because we've had decades and decades and decades of people saying, you've got to go to a 4-year school, and we're seeing the problem with that. The other issue is, to go back to the STEM side for just a moment, we know based on statistics that far too many kids, particularly females, minorities, lose interest in science, technology, engineering, and math. And particularly on the technology side, you don't always need a 4-year degree. Sometimes that's a 1 or 2-year technology.
But you need some basics in technology for almost any job.
And you know what? You're exactly right.
Yeah.
It's getting to a point in our society where a college, where a high school diploma simply doesn't cut it. Mm-hmm. Something beyond high school, and I think that's something that we have to emphasize. It might be 1 year, it might be 2, it might be 4, it might be 8, it might be longer. You need something. But we're seeing far too many kids lose interest in technology-oriented, and we've got to go back into the schools and get them interested again in science and engineering and technology. And many of our members are looking to do that and push that back into schools. We have to regenerate that, particularly among those populations that, to be honest, haven't been served well by that.
Yeah. Well, it used to be that employers would say, give me a kid who's going to show up on time and who's going to pass the requisite tests that they might have to undergo. I will train them. Mm-hmm. It sounds to me like you're saying there might be shifting it back more towards they need a higher skill level coming out of school.
I think there's still some of that. There are still some who can do that in different industries. But again, I think it's important to note whether that training, and I think it really needs to be formal based on what we're hearing, comes from the employer, or in many cases comes from, you know, a year or two at a community college, or a year or two at a technical school, or a year over here where you get a certificate to say, I can do that. I have that requisite skill and training and education, and you put a piece of paper and say, I can do that, is becoming more and more important.
Some parts of the state, Gene, there are regional workforce collaborations forming.
Yes.
Could you talk a little bit about them, and if employers, what is the attitude of employers towards them, and how does this address the problem?
I think it varies. I think that there's a lot of these WIBs, workforce investment boards, that are out there that many employers sit on. I think clearly trying to focus and figure out, one, what resources we have. I think this is crucial. What resources we have that are available to deploy into this field. How well are all of those working? How are the regional workforces working with the local employers? How do they tie back into state programs? And coming up with a comprehensive look to make sure that we're getting the right resources to those people who train them, getting the right resources particularly to the people who need jobs. And sometimes they're young people, and let's be honest, sometimes they're people who've had a particular skill, and that skill, they can't find a job there, and they need to be retrained. And some of it is, in all honesty, relocation. I know that's tough for a lot of people to do, but sometimes you might be in an area where your particular skill isn't in demand. There might be another place in Pennsylvania where it is. And I think we need to communicate that.
Well, I've often thought about just starting to teach, giving up everything, and becoming a teacher. I know that there have been recent articles about business professionals doing that. Do you think that would help engage students more? Or?
You know, I really do. And I know I'm not an expert on this, but I know from the bit I've read, sometimes, well, you don't have a degree in education, you don't have a certificate. Yeah. You know, look, I'm not an educational professional, and perhaps some of the educational professionals won't like to hear this. I think there are some people like yourself who can bring a particular skill, a particular background in, who may not have an education degree, who may not have that certificate or whatever that you need, who can come into a school and do a tremendous job motivating kids, who can give kids a perspective because they've been out there on the experience side. And I think that is something that we need to look at, particularly as we see in many schools there's a shortage of people, again, going back to the science, the technology, the engineering, and the math side, and we know that we have a shortage of people who can teach those. Well, why not turn it over to people who've been out there, maybe not in a traditional teaching side or profession, but who can come back in and do that.
One of the things that's happening, Gene, I guess, throughout some parts of our society, technology is rapidly advancing, and therefore the equipment changes rapidly that young people have to work with and master. And they, in some parts of the state, aren't businesses donating some of these pieces of equipment to either vo-tech schools or to colleges and universities, and trying to work with them to prepare students for those jobs in the future?
That's a great.
How's that working out?
That's a great point. Last summer, I had the pleasure of moderating a panel at the Jobs First Summit in Pittsburgh that the previous administration, Governor Corbett's administration, through L&I did. And we had some folks, I think 6 or 8 people on my panel, and we talked about how they were approaching this. And each of them had different challenges. Some were high tech, some were literally custodial services, trying to find the right people to fill that. And you're exactly right. A couple of them said, you know what? We found out that our local school didn't have the kind of machinery they needed to train the kids. So we literally went out, we bought it and put it in the school, and we developed a program where the kids go out and train on it. We bring them into the workplace, show them the other things that they need, and they've developed that conduit. It's almost like the pipeline I talked about that educates the kids, gives them the equipment they need, and brings them in. I think we need to see more of those partnerships with the private sector and their local educational institutions and encourage that.
That's great.
Last question of this segment.
I had the opportunity recently to speak to a young woman who was a junior, and she was trying to figure out what to do, where to go in her life, and she's doing an internship. I don't think we all have to go in and become professors, but do you think the school should reach out to more professionals and bring us in to talk about what we see as some of the opportunities in varying skill sets would be for them. I mean, I don't think we have to all become professors. Can't we just go into the schools and talk to them?
I think that's part of that.
Broaden their horizons a little bit.
Exactly. Try and light a fire. Try and encourage somebody who says, "I never thought about that as a profession. It really struck a chord with me. Tell me what I need to do.
Yeah.
Tell me what education I need. Tell me what I'm required to do." You never know what spark you're going to strike in a 14, 15, 16, 17-year-old kid. You never know what you're going to do that. And in my view, you need to find all the fuel you can. If that fuel is somebody coming from the outside, I'm great with that.
Good.
Okay. We'll be back with Gene Barr and segment 2 right after this. Stay tuned.
Behind the Headlines is brought to you as a public service by the Hospital and Health System Association of Pennsylvania, helping hospitals provide healing, health, and hope to communities across the state. And by the Pennsylvania Business Council, envisioning a commonwealth in which residents enjoy a very high quality of life in sustainable communities. The council works aggressively to define key long-term policy strategies and solutions to make the commonwealth more competitive, creating and sustaining a better Pennsylvania. Additional underwriting provided by the Worrell Corporation Foundation, based in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, by the Edward H. and Jeannie Arnold Foundation, and by the Pennsylvania Manufacturers Association. Business in Pennsylvania is our business. Behind the Headlines is also supported as a public service by Daily Express, transporting construction, farm, and industrial equipment throughout the United States, and by Blackford Ventures, LLC, a private equity firm seeking to make significant investments in real estate, proven business enterprises, and their leaders. Find out more at www.blackfordventures.com. And by the Pennsylvania Highway Information Association, the go-to source to learn about transportation projects and issues. Visit pahighwayinfo.org.
Hi, welcome back to Behind the Headlines. Maura and I are going to continue our conversation with Gene Barr in this segment, but we want to sort of move to an area that we haven't talked a lot about in the future. One of the areas that I work with in my classes, Gene, teaching government or teaching economics, is what is the appropriate role of government? What should government do in society? And of course, everyone has to make their own decision, don't they? And there are a lot of possible answers out there. But one of them has to do with perhaps it's the appropriate role, and it's a good thing for government to provide something we call public goods. And public goods are things that are too expensive for the public to provide by themselves, something that benefits the public, something that is perhaps non-excludable. You can toy with that particular criteria. But we want to look at the whole issue here of museums. Is it appropriate for government? Should government be spending money on museums? And if so, what is the what's the benefit to the public for a museum?
You know, you ask a really good question, and we look at it on almost a daily basis with the Chamber. Because you said it's a decision every person has to make, and they do. And in fact, the 253 members of this legislature and members of Congress have to basically look at that on a daily basis, and that should be part of what they look at when they weigh the appropriate role of government in terms of what they do. And I agree with you. I think that there are things that we can look at and probably all agree on at the national level. It's national defense. Clearly, delivering the mail is something that's, has always and is required for the government to do. Public safety, the courts. Our view is transportation is part of that and ought to be, which is why we were so heavily involved in the transportation discussion from late 2013 when we passed that. So I think all of those things clearly are. I think you can go a step further and say we need to provide some kind of safety net for our citizens when they have times of difficulty. I'm certainly part of that. And whether that, I think that probably goes beyond the United Way, and we as an organization are part of that, but I think it also goes into unemployment compensation, making sure that our folks have some kind of safety net. Now, obviously, putting the right parameters so those things aren't abused becomes a huge piece of the discussion as well. But as an individual who has a strong interest in American history, I think that it is government's role to protect the culture of this country, to protect the background of this country, to protect those things that symbolize what this country means, and we put them in places called museums, whether it's the Smithsonian, whether they're in Gettysburg, whether they're here in Harrisburg at the National Civil War Museum. Those things are part of our fabric as individuals, as a nation, and they need to be protected. I mean, clearly we could say, well, you know, go out and buy them and put them out to the first bidder, and they're in somebody's house and nobody ever gets to see them. I think people need to see they need to go to Independence Hall and see those things. They need to go down to the Smithsonian and see the flag that flew over Fort McHenry. Those are crucial. They need to be open to this country and its citizens.
I'm a person who loves museums, and I remember as a kid, you know, one of the best parts about being a kid was field trip day, and we all got to go to. We often went to museums. Are you seeing a decline in that happening in schools?
You know,
you think that's part of the problem here?
That's a great question. I serve on the board of the National Civil War Museum. I'm past chair. And what happened is the museum started off really well. And then, to be honest, what happened to a lot of museums was 2011. Those are 9/11, 2001. Yeah. And there was a decline across this country. People wanted to stay home. It's been a struggle to kind of get them back. I'm hoping that with gas prices the way they are, we do get a lot of students come into the Civil War Museum. They tend to come in, they go to the Capitol, they go to the Civil War Museum. And I think it's important to get them through a flow and a process and make it applicable to them. I always, from my perspective, history has got to be more than dates and just names and a place where a battle happened or a bill was signed or a treaty was signed. It's got to be the people. And I think that's what drives it when they understand that it's people much like themselves and their parents and their brothers and sisters and grandparents. That's who made the country, and that's what history is about. So I still do some things where I go into school to talk about particular eras, particularly the Civil War, and I try and talk to kids not about, you know, you mentioned General Grant, but you don't want to just let them try and memorize 1861 to 65 and this happened. Who are the people? What drove them to do that? Think about that. So that's really what we have to get kids involved in. This is a fabric of who they are.
Well, you have special insight into the National Civil War Museum in Harrisburg because you said you're on the board.
Yes.
And you find that I think something that the Civil War Museum does extraordinarily well is to tell history comes alive if it's told as a story. And that's why Shelby Foote was such a great Civil War historian. Because what did he start out as? He started out as a novelist, as a fiction writer. He knew that to bring people into the story, that you had to tell it as a story. And he did such a remarkable job on that. What are some of the unique contributions that the Civil War Museum in Harrisburg makes to the quality of life in South Central Pennsylvania? What would you?
Well, first off, it's one of the places, in our view, the only place you can go and see the perspective about the entire war from both sides. You see the causes of slavery. You can see all that from the beginning. If you go to other places, they'll touch on a specific battle or maybe a particular piece of it. We do all of that, and we try and focus on other aspects of why Harrisburg. People don't understand how important Harrisburg was during that 1861-65 period. The fact that this place was almost attacked. They were just a few miles, the Confederates were just a few miles from here. I think people have their eyes open when they see that. They never realized Harrisburg was the target, never realized what happened in this area. From my perspective, local history, knowing about where you live. I grew up in the Philadelphia area. I love knowing my local history. We don't do enough of that either. We don't do enough of history generally, I don't think, and we clearly don't make it, I don't think, unfortunately, in many cases, interestingly enough. I think to go back to your previous point, bring in people from the outside who can talk about particular aspects, who can bring in artifacts to show what life was like during those periods, whether it's a Revolutionary War period, whether it's a Civil War, World War II. Fortunately, we still have a few veterans around who can talk about that. We need to take greater advantage of that.
What's the status of the National Civil War Museum in Harrisburg right now?
We're actually doing very well.
Okay, good.
We have a CEO who's been on for a couple of years now, who's done a great job attracting foundations. I think it's important to note that maybe not 100%, but pretty much almost 100% of every museum gets some kind of state support. To go back to our previous point, these facilities, institutions are the fabric of our country, and there needs to be some public support to them in many ways to make sure that they stay there. We don't want these artifacts, we don't want the story of our nation to be lost. So we're actually doing very well. Attendance is good. We get a lot of the school groups in. We get people coming in not only from almost every state, but from other countries to come to this place.
Are you doing any of those night at the museums? You know, after those movies, a lot of museums have had little sleepovers.
I saw that. We've had that
kids.
as a discussion. I think you're going to see some very interesting exhibits coming in. Right now we've been focusing on each year, 61, 62, 63, 150th anniversary of each of those. We're looking to do a baseball exhibit because baseball was extremely important to the soldiers of the time, and bring that up and kind of weave that into the whole story as well.
That's great.
What's the pace of school field trips, Gene, at the present time? Are they in the downswing, upswing?
It's been pretty steady for us. Yeah, it's been a very steady source. And again, if we don't, and this is why it's so important to get those groups in, if we don't get those school groups in, if we don't get children interested in this, then our interest is virtually meaningless if you don't have that next generation willing to carry on that story of American history. That's why it's so important.
Yeah, we see that in the past, our children have had more problems with English and math, and we've been addressing those. And at the university level, we see a slight improvement here.
Yes.
But now we find that our children test most poorly at history. And if we don't know our past, how can we tell where we are or where we're going? And the museums play a big role in telling us where we've been and where we are now, don't they?
Exactly. And from a chamber perspective, just switch back to that, not only my personal interest, but I think it's also important to note, why is this country different? In my view, it's different because we're founded on a free market principle, founded on a principle of opportunity for people. No guarantees, but opportunities. And museums can help tell that story, because that's really what brought immigrants to this country, continues to bring immigrants to the country, this opportunity of that. And that's really the story of this country, is opportunity, and a lot of that is economic based. And from the Chamber's perspective, as we work on a day-to-day basis, we want to work to supplement that culture and that atmosphere of opportunity, the ability that for you and your family to make the best decisions economically for you on a daily basis. And believe it or not, in my view, museums help tell that story, because that really is, in many ways, the history of this country.
Do you think there's anything museums should be doing differently going forward?
Clearly more technology-based, interactive. People we know
Kids love hands-on.
Kids love hands-on stuff. They don't want to come in and just see something behind glass. They like to come in and look at it. As I mentioned, I've gone into schools many times. I've brought in equipment from the Civil War in so they can feel it. Wow, you had to wear wool on a day when it was 85, 90 degrees. Yeah, you did.
And those reenactors still do.
And they still do. It's all wool, and they're carrying a lot of equipment. And but making kids think about that, making kids think about the sacrifices that went in from men and women in this country that they had to do over the history of this country to get us to where we are now is crucially important.
Okay, Gene, we want to thank you very much for sharing your time with us
and
our viewers, and we look forward to having you back again soon.
I'd love to be back.
Again, you can watch us on YouTube. You can watch our archives at the voiceofpa.net, and we look forward to joining you again next week on Behind the Headlines. We'll see you then.